Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the latest BASRAT and Steroplast Injury Rehab Network event. A little bit of housekeeping just before we get things underway. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. As always, it's great to know where you're all tuning in from and what different mix of professions, etc. we've got in the group. So please let us know in the chat. Some admin, we will be sending out certificates of attendance to all of you that are joining us live this evening. If you're not joining us live and you're watching this on the recording, unfortunately, we can't make one for you. Steve's presentation is going to be around 30 to 40 minutes. We'll follow that up with a Q&A. So as we go through, please post your questions in the Q&A box. You can see on the graphic there, that is the specific Q&A box, not the chat. If it's in the chat, we will miss it. If you could also have a look at what questions have already been posted, because somebody might have had the same idea as you and already asked. In that case, you can just upvote and we'll take the most popular questions as a priority. As mentioned, the presentation this evening will be recorded. We will make the link available for a limited time afterwards, and we'll send that to everyone who's registered. A little bit about BASRAT. We're the professional association and regulator for sport rehabilitators. We've been hosting these webinars now for about 18 months in an effort to give you all some free CPD and some support during COVID. If you appreciate our work and you'd like to support it by becoming an associate member of the organisation, there are the benefits, there's the cost, and if you'd like to know more, you can get in touch with myself or our admin team after the webinar. I'll hand you over to Andrew. He's going to get us underway this evening and introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Ollie. Hi, everyone. Thanks always, Ollie, for your support. Really enjoy hosting these events with BASRAT. And as Ollie said, we hope these events can add some value as some great free CPD. We've been really pleased with the quality of the speakers that we've had over the last 18 months, and the engagement that we've had from the groups has been fantastic. So thanks very much. Just a little quick introduction to Steroplast Healthcare. So it's a medical supplies company based in Manchester, essentially first aid and medical consumables for sports injuries. So everything from tapes and strappings, emergency and trauma equipment, and even the pharmaceuticals that a team doctor might need. So we're really proud to work in partnership with a range of teams, particularly those in the Northwest where we're based, some national governing bodies, and obviously to work with those that are working in sports rehabilitation as well. If you could just move it on, please, Ollie. So the Injury Rehab Network, we started in 2019, really due to the fact that a lot of the professionals and people that we were working with in sport didn't really have a forum to collaborate and share good practice, often working in isolation or within their own organisation, but not able to get together and share ideas and collaborate. So the format really was initially on a face-to-face basis, bringing people together, having an expert guest speaker talking around a topic, and then facilitating some networking. During lockdown, obviously, we weren't able to do that, and we've been really pleased to be able to work with BASRAT to take the events online. And actually, that's been a fantastic thing, because we're now able to take the events to a much wider global audience, which is really good. I know there's lots of people from all across the UK and further afield joining this evening. So really pleased to have Steve with us this evening, and we'll introduce Steve briefly and obviously let him do the job of introducing it himself. We've got a good schedule of events coming up, so please do keep an eye out on what we've got booked in. But Steve's background is in rugby union. He's been a physio at the Olympics, I think in beach volleyball, and he's currently established Grow Physio as a means to give back to the sports rehabilitation community, I guess. So I'll let Steve introduce himself, like I said. But thanks, Steve. Thanks, Ollie. And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. And yeah, massive thank you to Ollie and Andrew for letting me sort of talk on this great platform, really. And I think probably echoing what these guys have done is sort of an excellent thing, really, to try and almost give back. And that's exactly kind of where Grow Physio came from. So if no one is sure what Grow Physio is. That is no surprise. It is about 6 months old. It was just a means for me when I stepped out of professional sporting world, really. When I left, I had loads of material and sort of bits and pieces on my phone, video-wise, rehab-wise, that I wanted to sort of share with the world, really. So I've put together, there's about 8 courses on growphysio.com, which, again, to try and help everybody out, it is £1 for 30 days. So the intention initially was, look, if people want to have access to a professional sports world placement, they can do that. There's also mentorship stuff on there once a month that we all get together. There's loads of different people using it, everyone from graduates right the way through to someone who's worked in professional football for 10 years. So it's a really good mix, really, and it currently looks at a variety of different injuries. At the moment, I'm kind of going from the bottom upwards. So there's Achilles, ankles, calves, hamstrings. I've just done the injury prevention module as well, which is getting some really good feedback. And then I've just put on there a sports taping module as well. So again, please do use it. If you want to have a little look at sort of what it may look like, again, you can jump on the website or on Instagram. There's quite a lot of free material on there as well. So grow.physio is the Instagram link if anyone wants to have a little look on there. There is a link as well following Christian Eriksen's cardiac event. Hopefully, Ollie, you don't have the same. You're just talking about him having cardiac issues as well. But yeah, there's a full sort of almost emergency medicine care thing link on there to a YouTube thing. So if people want to jump on that Instagram thing and have a little look at that, it's there to try and help support, really. But I guess the reason that we're here is to talk all things about calf rehab. I'm going to play you a slightly shortened version of the material from Grow Physio. There is a lot of video content on there. And hopefully, I think a lot of people are sick of looking at PowerPoints and things. So hopefully you enjoy it. I will catch up with you all at the end. So as Ollie said, pop some Q&As in. Be delighted to sort of come back and answer some bits and pieces. But I hope you enjoy it. And I'll see you all at the end.
Okay, hi everybody, and welcome back to Grow Physio. So in this section, what we're going to look at is trying to bring together everything that we've gone through in terms of the theory, the assessment, some of the treatment interventions, and how that then applies into building this athlete up from a rehabilitation perspective. So again, the focus is going to be on that gastrocnemius versus your soleus. They are not working against each other, quite the opposite, they work together. However, it's really important, I feel, to emphasize the difference in the approaches and the management strategies right the way through that journey. So what are we going to look at? So we'll look at the subjective and the objective very quickly and just recap on some of the findings that we may well look at, and how that looks at giving us a classification and a diagnosis that we can work with so we can assign timescales appropriately. We'll look at, again, interventions slightly, and when we look at dripping those in. So during a loading process, we may well need to do a little bit of work just to address some of the changes and the work that goes through these calves, because at times there's clearly going to be need to maybe just reduce some tone and just calm that tissue down. That doesn't mean that you've irritated anything, but it may help, it may restore some objective markers when you do that. We will look initially at some of the reduced capacity loading options. So we try and make all rehab as functional as we can. And then again, for the athlete, for that buy-in, it's really important that they can see how what they're doing applies to how they're going to be and how that integrates them into their appropriate sport. We'll look at rehab progressions. And again, it's really important to always have a progression and a regression to each exercise. So you can quite quickly adapt where that athlete is and give them something that's a little bit more challenging, or actually go the other way and maybe give them something that's a little easier to do. We'll then, in the second half of this, so the late stage elements, and that's where we'll focus on the return to sport. So this is a two-part process. This is the early and moderate sort of loading, which again might be enough for some individuals, but actually that later stage reintegration into sport there and back into running, that's covered in the next stage as well. So some of the problems that tend to occur with recurrent athletes is during their rehab, they've maybe not gone heavy enough. So has there been enough sufficient load? Have they developed that tendon stiffness? And is there enough hypertrophy? And quite often, if the athlete presents and they've had problems before, doing like a circumferential test and looking at the output of that calf versus the sort of measurements of the bulk itself in that mid-belly, they may well throw up little issues that they've never restored that sort of calf strength and bulk. Have they held the contraction long enough? So a lot of evidence suggesting sort of 30 to 60 seconds now might actually be what you need to make changes in the tendon. And actually, why is that not applicable into the muscle itself? Has it been specific enough? So we need to target really, have we replicated what that athlete is going to do within their sport? So have we recreated the rate of force development and the demands that that sport and that position requires? Is it stiff enough? Again, this is where I mentioned about that sort of 30-second eccentric. Sounds like ages, but actually some of the evidence we'll talk about later suggests that the slower the hold, the more benefit we have. And it might be that we don't go through full range. We maybe just go either side of sort of neutral. But again, seems to make sense to me that actually doing an increased load has many benefits. And is it specific enough? So that athlete will move in a certain way that they've developed over their careers. And actually, everybody's unique. You will have some athletes who look, as I mentioned, sort of amazing at top speed. We had an athlete who looked absolutely horrendous until he got to about sort of 7 meters a second. And then beyond there looked like an amazing, sort of graceful, really efficient mover. But actually, it was a real challenge when we try and rehab him, because when we start to build him into some of the lower level running, he looks awful, looks very clumsy, and it's almost a little bit of a grenade until we get to those higher speeds. So you may need to adapt what you're doing in a gym setting to cater for that. And the other factor with this is it early enough? So some really good evidence to suggest that actually if we can get the athlete loading again after sort of a couple of days versus 9 days, that can have a massive difference in terms of the return to play time of that athlete. So for example, if you've got a grade 2 gastrocnemius tear and you start to load it early doors from that day 2 mark versus day 9, again, you might be returning that athlete at sort of 10 days, 10 days maybe for like a grade 1 or sort of up to 14 days for a grade 1 versus maybe actually it taking sort of up to 4 weeks to get that athlete back if you don't load them early enough. So these are a couple of examples. So this professional rugby player here, he is just loading up by pressing into that core ball and working in a comfortable range for him. Really useful. He can then vary the amount of pressure that he's performing and pressing into the ball. And similarly, he can control the range of motion that he's going through. The other things he can do is just adapt very sort of common exercises as we are here. Looking at, again, just 4-foot loading. This athlete's going through the concentric and eccentric and isometric phases. But actually, it might be that you just ask that athlete to stick in an isometric position. You can do that in different ways. So you might well have that athlete doing that double leg to reduce the amount of load. You might have them with their feet on the wall, doing a bridge with their feet up against the wall, but onto their forefoot. And you might go a double leg into a sort of split stance, into a sort of single leg motions as well. A really useful adjunct to rehab, particularly in the acute phases and subacute phases, is blood flow restriction. So you can see the cuffs that are around this athlete just above the level of that sort of gastroc. And what it's doing is almost applying a circumferential pressure that actually creates like an occluded area. So we're getting less oxygen basically pumping through that calf, so we can get the DOMS benefits without actually loading that athlete up. So you'll see that they've got dumbbells on their knees. You can vary the weight of that dumbbell. You might not even have any dumbbell on there at all. But what we would typically sort of see is this sort of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, 15 seconds on sort of protocols really. Or we're doing repetitions of 30 repetitions at that level, 15 repetitions, then another 15 repetitions, and then another 15 repetitions. So there's different ways that you can load it. It doesn't have to be in this position. Loads of other different ways that you can load it. You can load it in a body weight position. There's no reason why not. But while they have reduced capacity, you may need to adapt what you're doing. You could even stick them on during a sort of watt bike session or a sort of cycling session that somebody has. And again, by reducing the oxygen flow to the calf, you may well get some really useful benefits. They do say try not to do sort of more than 7 minutes of it in total with the cuff on, without sort of taking it off for a good sort of 5 to 10 minute period. And to be honest, that's normally enough for the athlete anyway. Some other ways that you can deload the athlete, clearly the pool is a really useful option. You can benefit from the sort of shallow end, the deep end. Obviously, the deeper they go, the less body weight they have going through that calf and Achilles. You get all the hydrostatic pressure benefits, and you can actually do lots of other different things with that. So you might well find that you can do tiptoe raises, tiptoeing, calf raises. You might want to do some drills like your A skips, your B skips, or even get that athlete jogging if they're able to in a pool first of all. To deload the athlete even further, what you might decide to do is actually use the side of the pool, so they're using their upper limbs to further deload that athlete. The central picture here is the Alter G, which is an anti-gravity treadmill. And again, what it does is you can specify how much body weight percentage you're putting through that athlete. So they're in a bit of a chamber that's inflated. And again, what you're looking at are things like the control, the height of the calf raise. And if there's any discrepancies and things, it's a really useful option because it often has a little window in the back. You may well, again, on the Alter G, do some gait re-education in a reduced load position. So you can normally apply anything from 40% to 100% load through that athlete using an Alter G. So really useful ways to, again, build in some of the gains that you've maybe made in terms of maybe manual therapy things like your sort of windlass mechanisms, just so they get used to loading appropriately through there. And make sure, again, that they're confident doing that. So in this reduced body weight position, the athlete may well avoid overloading the opposite side, the sort of non-injured limb, if you like, and they may feel a little bit more comfortable going on that 50% to 50% weight distribution in that position. So this is the reformer. So some of our athletes used a great place local to us, sort of a Infinite Pilates, where we use sort of the coaches there to build in some of this sort of introduction to impact work and get them loading through that calf and Achilles complex. So what it is it's a sliding platform really attached onto some bungee cords, and you can vary the load going through that. So you can see here we're almost starting to try and mimic with this athlete the sort of scrum tackling position that's quite appropriate for him. So it's, again, functionally relevant for that athlete. This one, again, getting them to fire their glute and make sure that they don't lose that drop and they maintain that stickability of that calf and that heel isn't dropping during this. So they're getting that stiffness built up. These two sort of drills here, you can see on the right-hand side, the isometric loading process that we go through. So these are something that I would normally use for an Achilles issue with some of the protocols, but actually very relevant for a calf loading process where we don't just load the athlete in a neutral position. We actually almost imagine it like a clock face where we are almost loading them from, if 12 o'clock is the foot straight and the ankle in neutral, if we rotate that sort of lower foot round to 10 o'clock, to 11 o'clock, to 12 o'clock, to 1 o'clock, to 2 o'clock on a clock face, what we end up with doing is almost holding that load there. So as you can see there, I'm just showing this athlete the different angles that we want to carry that out with. So as they rotate, what they're doing is just sticking in various different angles. So then she's off to sort of 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in that position. You might want to hold each one of those anywhere from sort of 6 seconds to 12 seconds. But again, you're just repeating that motion. And then we do that before any of this sort of loading later on. Now, a really important factor is that during sort of gait and walking, obviously the ground contact time that we have can vary depending on the speed of that athlete. So it might be that there's little cues that translate into running from this. So the cadence, so trying to increase the number of steps that we have. So we're reducing the stride distance that they have, running lighter. All these things that reduce the ground contact time seem to have quite a significant impact. So actually, when we get them walking, it might be that instead of getting them walking at a really slow pace, we actually need to increase the pace for something like a soleus to avoid too much ground contact time. Incline treadmill work. So when we return an athlete, particularly a soleus, what we may find is that the actual load capacity and the endurance of that muscle is significantly reduced. So we used to spend a lot of time with athletes just walking on an incline. So they'd set up their little documentaries or whatever it was that they were watching on Netflix and almost just go through a process for sort of up to sort of 45 minutes of just walking. Because in these limited phases where we don't want to do anything explosive, we don't want that capacity and endurance of that muscle to fail on us. If we then sort of look at other options, so the cross trainer actually loads the forefoot quite a lot, but it takes out a lot of the impact. So this is a little bit hitty-missy, really. A really useful tool because it does bias the calf, but actually if you do too much of it, you can get caught out. And that's the same with a stepper, really. Really useful way, much like the Jacob's ladder, to actually load that athlete from a calf perspective, but without but with bias onto that soleus. So if we think about the knee itself, anything above sort of 60 degrees is going to load massively the soleus instead of the gastroc. And that is a really important part when we look at rehab. So during rehab, the athlete may well present with symptoms. So what is acceptable? What do we need to really keep a close eye on? And what is unacceptable, really? So there's a lot more evidence available in the literature regarding tendons. And that sort of range that they're happy with is that sort of 0 to 3 out of 10. So when you ask the athlete, how painful is it on that VAS or numerical pain rating? If they're 0 to 3, we're fairly happy and comfortable. Now, if it's a gastroc, what you're probably going to get is that they get little sharp pains that occur. Now, that's normally a bit of a clue for them and for you, and they're not happy pushing through that. And again, that sharp pain might be sort of 6 out of 10 plus. Contrast to that is the soleus. So the soleus, again, it can grumble around that 0 to 3. And actually, you may well be upsetting or interfering with that normal sort of scar development. And actually, if it is starting to get up to a 4 or a 5 on that soleus, it's a real worrier that actually it's not a very happy environment for that soleus. And you may need to back off a little bit with your load. Now, 2 really important things for me with rehab is the repeatability. So whatever you've done in rehab, before we get into it, is whatever that content of that session is, the athlete should feel like they can re-perform that the next day. If they can't, then the likelihood is that you've overloaded that, and actually you may need to build in more recovery or look at really adapting the amount of load that you're applying to that athlete. It might be the volume, it might be the speed, it might be various other elements. I know one other thing with an author that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, I'll probably get it wrong, is that sort of monitoring. So a really good clue, again, is that 1 to 2 hours post-training, how does it feel? And you can also couple that with sort of how it feels the following morning. So if they're waking up and they're sort of hobbling around a bit, or they've got any symptoms on walking in particular alone, those things are real clues to me that I've actually done too much with this athlete. The athlete should always be able to walk pain-free and almost symptom-free, really, during the rehab process. So this is your more traditional sort of surfing of the rehab curves. It's sometimes put here. And basically what you normally do is go through a fairly steady process where we are looking at sort of building the athlete up. This is me just sort of playing around on this surf machine. And actually, as we introduce more variables into the mix, we're trying to improve the sort of the speed at which we're exposing things at. Now, if you apply that with everyone, it's going to happen the same as it happened here. You're going to veer off course and feel like you are constantly trying to battle. So it's really important. You've got your gastroc approach and you've got your soleus approach. So more information on that, really. So if you've got two different surfers, you've got two different waves that you need to run. So if you've got a gastroc, you need to surf the gastroc wave. And what that looks like, if we look at the graph on the left-hand side there, the green line that's there, it's quite a linear build-up. So we might do some work offloading the athlete and then building them up in the gym. We may just incrementally build that load exposure on the pitch or on a treadmill from a running perspective. And it's fairly uniform. And it's also quicker than your soleus. Now, this isn't time scale based at all, but it's mainly just to sort of emphasize the point. But your gym based time with a soleus tear, for me, is considerably higher. And the other thing that I just wanted to highlight from this graph is almost that instead of going to that sort of low level plodding that you sometimes do with a calf, maybe a gastroc can get away with it because you've got that soleus that's got its back and it's taking a lot of that force absorption. What you actually end up with a soleus is actually what you may want to do is just reduce the plodding around a pitch, that sort of just go for a warm-up lap. Because even doing that, sometimes athletes don't even make it round and you end up sort of pulling your hair out. That's probably why I've got no hair. Why that athlete is just suddenly tightening up incredibly just by doing a plod. And then you almost feel like, oh, they're not ready to do anything. But you might need to drip them in at a higher speed. So, for example, this would be the worst sort of a possible thing, really, that you may well do with a soleus, is almost that super slow running. So you might have a really sort of quick, fast twitch athlete who you then have, you're telling them to run slower. And actually what they look like is horrendous. And they then end up sort of with an increased ground contact time. And actually what ends up happening is you end up with issues because you're asking that athlete to move in a different way. Whereas actually it might actually be a lot safer to build that athlete up, make them really dynamic, get their plyos done in the gym, and then drop them into their running at a higher level. And this just highlights it again. So if we look back at the sort of theory of the soleus, again, this is probably where the little bromance and admiration for your soleus has come from, really, that recognition that although it's sort of a bit of a silent hero, really, it absorbs a whole lot more load and generates so much more force than your gastrocnemius. So I think that's why it's commonly underloaded during that rehab process. So you can see the soleus there, it's probably 3 times the amount of force that your gastrocnemius can create at those different running speeds. So speeds just along the bottom there for reference. So really important, really. So if you've got a gastrocnemius versus a soleus, you need to pick the amount of load that you're aiming for. And these are just a few little guides, really. So your gastroc, you might not need to go up to sort of beyond sort of 1.5 times body weight, really. Your soleus, though, might well even go sort of 5 times body weight. If you don't address that, then these sorts of things can happen where you just go, the wheels fall off and you end up getting re-injured again if that load hasn't been developed. If it's not that, that time it might be in another area. So with that athlete that I was talking about who really likes a high speed, actually in hindsight, it was probably because his soleus strength wasn't good enough that he then started to develop some real patella tendon problems. And actually it might be that lack of absorption and force development of the soleus that didn't allow for that absorption. And then he was sort of overloading quads and patella tendon above there. And the other markers on here just give you a little bit of a clue regarding the body weight of the athlete. So depending on what athlete you've got in front of you, these are some of the markers that we look at. So what do we need really to know in terms of building the athlete up? So we have to know how much load is roughly going through the calf with different exercises. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult to progress that athlete on. So this is your more traditional eccentric loading program, isn't it, really? So if we have your Alfredson program, really, that we had, that sort of very progressive eccentric loading program, 3 lots of 15 of both extended knee and bent knee exercises twice a day, really time consuming. But actually, again, sort of what I was alluding to earlier on, some of your other research that's gone out there, that much heavier load, you don't need to do anywhere near as much in terms of volume, and you can still get the same sort of benefits, really. So if we look from sort of left to right there, again, this is sort of the easiest thing to do, really, either with weight above you or a backpack on or whatever it may be. You're going from the ground up into a calf raised position. You don't get any dorsiflexion, really. The floor will stop you at plantigrade. So if that is one of your aims, good place to start. If you want to build that up, you might want to put them on a step and actually put a little blocker there, something like a weights plate, just so they have a little tactile limit, really, that they go to. You might want to build that athlete up again into a sort of single leg position. If you're going heavy, I really like the box position, in that sort of hip lock position with one side, and you're working that back leg. You can do the opposite, so you could be loading the front leg and keeping the back leg straight. And then obviously we've got sort of single leg through full range right into that dorsiflexed outer range terminal position where some of those calf and Achilles issues occur. Now, something that we don't usually see enough of, in my opinion, is your sort of soleus loading. So we need to go beyond 60 degrees. So this is a nice sort of wall squat position, working on double leg calf raising. Massive bias onto the soleus. Probably not heavy enough, but not a bad place to start. You can go split stance, or you can even go into sort of a single leg position. This is quite a demanding exercise, and it might be that you need some stability from sort of a wall or something for them to hold on to during it. Again, should be really slow. This is probably a little bit too quick. If they aren't recruiting from glute, or they're collapsing, that sort of corkscrewing motion, this is quite a nice way just to reintroduce that. So get the glute firing, get your pelvic control and that sort of Trendelenburg reduced, and go from there. Then we've obviously got sort of lunge positions, this sort of split stance where we've got the athlete lifting up single leg on that front leg. You can add load onto the front of the leg if needs be, add little dumbbells, whatever you need to, really, or do that sort of rear foot supported. Now, this might be a regression, or it might be a progression if you are, depending on how much load you've got on there. So you can go into a seated sort of Smith press, again, work off the steps so you've got full range, and you can either go double leg or you can go single leg. And again, vary the amount of time that they're performing that for, try and make it replicate what they may be doing in their sport. If we look on the right-hand side now, so this is one of our athletes, again, using that sort of very heavy loading strategy on that rear leg. So they're going up into a sort of a calf raise, massive bias on the gastroc on the back leg. If they do the opposite leg, so they're actually lifting up from their foot that's on that platform, then again, the focus will all be on that sort of soleus. So you can, again, load it really nicely in that position in quite a nice, safe way. Other alternatives, so you have this hamstring curl machine. So again, you can sort of adapt equipment that you find in a common gym to actually suit your athlete accordingly. So you might want to do double leg versions, single leg progressions. You might do isometrics here, you might do concentrics, and then again, just it might be that you go much slower than this with some of that sort of eccentric loading. On the right-hand side, we've just introduced sort of a decline angle at whatever angle you want to work on. So you can use 1 or 2. And again, that just works into that terminal sort of dorsiflex position where some of those issues can occur. Now, the other thing that's really worth noting is only working on the vertical propulsion of your calf isn't enough for running athletes. We need to build them up in a forward momentum, really. So you can see this is happening with the athlete here. So she's using the prowler, and she's just doing prowler walks, and she can build in some knee drive or hip lock positions. And again, it starts to prepare the athlete quite nicely for that build into more than just walking. They can then actually start to do some quite quick footwork drills with that. So they're really looking at that sort of stickability. So they're not looking for distance. And then you can do the opposite, where they're actually doing some little sprints with the prowler, and look at how that builds up and translates very quickly into a running drill position. Things to look at in terms of focus: we need to get the stiffness, so that heel's not dropping. How much ground contact time is there, and what's that sort of forward drive like? We can do that in different planes. So to prepare for athletes who are multi-directional, going backwards, again, focus on that posterior chain, the hamstring and calf complexes. Again, stick with the same cues. They want to reduce the amount of time that they are spending in contact with the ground and loading through that region. So a few different other ways to build that up. So we may be looking again at the stickability, using the wall as a bit of a support mechanism. So we can build that up just doing knee drives, one side to the other, get them confident and get them used to going through that process. And then we can do like a rocked calf raise, so we're actually going through full range. So we're stepping back. The working foot is actually the left foot. And again, you've got that nice hip lock position that the athlete will likely end up getting at that later phase during running. You can use something like a foam roller just to get a little bit more of an uneven surface and get the motion a little bit more dynamic. And again, that stickability at the end, looking at the amount of height that they have there, really important. You can do some drops. So it might be that, again, you're starting to just build that athlete up, introducing some different variables there. To progress on, really what we can do is some swaps. So we're just looking again at making sure that we stick, so there's not a heel drop there. You can see here there's a slight little give on the left-hand side compared to the right. If that's too tough, you can narrow that down and make the steps smaller, so you're not lifting as high. And you can step back to get more of that propulsion effect. So again, a really nice little option for that sort of running athlete. You can do alternate, so you can do 1, 2, 3s. So you're doing alternate sides. Similarly to before, you might find that actually there's issues in that sort of lumbar pelvic region, and using external cues like a Swiss ball are really helpful for a lot of athletes, because what you're aiming to do is almost tighten the left glute up to, as shown here, to then enable that athlete to drive forward without any hip internal rotation or sort of collapse, ideally through that sort of midfoot region. So what you try as a cue really to do is almost as you contract, that ball should raise about 1 centimeter. You can do that again in different planes. This is just to show you. But as you lift up with that, again, you can sort of see as you go through the motions with that, you're trying to maintain that glute control. And again, you can just do that with calf bias as shown there. You can do that with the front foot, the sort of the foot that's in a hip lock position. You can put that up against the wall almost to mimic the position that maybe sort of a hamstring tear would occur in, where the hips 90 and knees extended if needs be. This next video is just me discussing really some of the ways that you can maybe engage that tib post. So if you see that the foot is lacking control, this may be a little cue that you need to work on with that athlete.
So if you want to start to turn your
tib post control work into something a little bit more functional and weight bearing, this is quite a nice position to start. So you're going to pop the band around your calcaneus. You're going to take it up almost as high as you can towards almost over that sort of talus region. Now that's going to pull your heels together. What I want you to do is almost fight against that position. And then from this inner arch, is almost imagine you've got a hook that is pulling up. So you're almost trying to create more activation through that arch there. The other cue that we sometimes give is almost drawing that big toe backwards towards you, but you're really trying to lift that medial arch from that position to try and activate and maintain a neutral foot position and not allow that sort of pes planus, that overpronated position to occur. So once you're holding that position, again, that in itself is quite a nice exercise. If you want to then progress that, you could go into more of a calf raised position, so go on double leg, and then slowly back down again. And right the way through the range, monitor what's happening with the alignment of the Achilles to make sure that there's no increased angulation that might suggest that you're starting to get some tilt through there. And then again, come back up into that calf raised position, look after the control, and then back down again. If you want to progress that further, you can almost do your windscreen wipers in that position. So you're going to lift up on both feet, and then you're going to actually pull your heels apart, and then slowly let them come back together again, and then go out again, and back in again, and then slowly come down. And again, lift up into that plantar flex loaded position, allow those heels to fan out, back in again, and then slowly back down again. And that is a really nice way to start to really work that tib post, and you'll start to feel a burn anywhere around that sort of medial malleolus and through that tendon as that tib post comes up. That'll fatigue, it might become a bit domsy because it probably hasn't been used a great deal leading up to this. So give that a go. That will hopefully give you a little bit more control around that mid and rear foot and maintain that neutral position of that foot in a functional setting. So there you go. So if we then look at building up the single leg exposure, so this hip lock position is really important for running athletes. So we can start that off the floor. We can also do that off a step. So we're encouraging that end range dorsiflexion control really from there. So if you are doing it in this way, again, it is more gastroc biased using the rear leg. If you are using the leg that is on the step itself, and again, you can have that hanging off the edge of the step if you want to, so you're actually lifting with the foot on the box, the bias is all on that soleus because your hip position is around that sort of 90-degree mark, along with that sort of knee flexed position. Now, this isn't necessarily something that you do early, but just while we're showing it, these are some of the sort of ways you could develop that. So you've got as much offload as you want from your hands. And again, you're looking at sort of any of the sort of little plyometric drills at reduced body weight. So you can take as much weight as you want over the bar or between tricep dip bars and see how we build that up. The bouncing backwards and forwards is actually quite a risk-reward thing later on because you're mimicking really sometimes the mechanism that athlete has injured their calf in. So that eccentric end of range terminal dorsiflexion plus that knee extension is a very typical way that gastrocnemius tends to be torn. So if we just look at the different sprinter variations again, so this is how you may well just build that athlete up. So you start in single leg and then with a flat foot, and then using your body momentum to take you through. The next phase on from there is to then do some slow swaps. And again, we're really focusing on the stick that we've got. So we're making sure that that loading through the forefoot occurs and they aren't dropping through that heel. Look for any asymmetries that there may be at foot, ankle, or pelvis. And then really it's just a case of building up the speed at which this athlete is performing those. And then we have the variations. So little quick feet, and then adopting that normal triple extension at the stance leg and that hip lock position on the other. So triple extension, is key with these. So that hip extension, knee extension, ankle extension. And again, you can build that up accordingly. So this isn't just sort of a theoretical thing. This is how it may look with athletes that we've worked with in the past. So this athlete, again, doing his 1, 2, 3s. And you can also approach the wall from distance and then build in some of your stick work there. This next one is sort of a up to 10. So if we have a look at how quick this athlete is, again, we're looking at that nice controlled element, but building up the speed. This might well form part of your sort of squad dynamic. So it might be an injury prevention thing. And again, looking at different planes of motion that you work in, again, really important parts of loading that athlete. So that is basically the early to moderate sort of stage loading process. So this is the sort of half time mark, if you like. This is only half of building the athlete into their program. There is all the sort of ways that we build the athlete into running and their sport in the second half. But really, take homes from this side of things is that early loading is actually really important for the athlete. That doesn't mean going out and running. That means exposing the tissue to an acceptable load that they can tolerate without any sort of form of reaction. For example, if you start loading at day 2 versus day 9, there are some real implications in terms of how long that athlete will take to return to sport. You may need to modify things that you're doing to enable that process to occur. And things like active recovery are key words that we would use in sort of professional sport to make sure that we address maybe some other secondary issues, but actually also not just resting is rarely an option. And you're never going to ask that athlete to stop everything that they're doing. You should be able to adapt everything to enable yourself to either load the tissue itself if it's appropriate, or certainly work on all the other streams that may well sort of help protect that that particular tissue. Stiffness is key, so that calf and tendon stiffness, really important to get that neuromuscular control element that's there, reduce the body weight as you need to enable that stick factor. So all the things that we showed you with the sort of offloading in pools, in alter Gs, on reformers, or even just plonking yourself in between some sort of tricep dip bars. Again, however you can do it, get that good quality stickability and stiffness in that tendon. The education is key. So as you take the athlete through their journey, really, really important to make sure that they are aware as to how long it's going to take that athlete to progress, and also what we're using to monitor how well they are progressing. The athlete may well have some misbeliefs or some fear avoidance strategies that are going on. They may not load that calf that's maybe been torn because they're worried about it. But actually, the more that you reinstall load and expose that athlete to an acceptable load, their confidence will grow, and they're less likely to have sort of secondary injuries from overloading a different part of their body. The failed rehab options certainly seem to be the ones that haven't been exposed to enough load or under enough for enough time, or almost sort of replicated the demands of that sport. All of that will be discussed in the second part, really. So that late stage calf rehab and the preparation phase is really, really important. That's the bit that often gets missed. So people do this bit reasonably well. It's the next bit that really you need to get right, where we get the plyos all involved as well. So congratulations. So that's the first half done. No brainer. Your next stage is really just to go on and do the late stage and return. And if you're watching this in isolation, again, these are the sorts of learning opportunities that we have at growphysio.com. Loads of information on social media. So jump online, get some follows going, make some comments. Really enjoy sort of going through the process with people. So do get in touch with us. And I'll hopefully see you in the second part.
There you go. Did that all come through all right?
Yeah, we're back. We're back.
Perfect.
Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
So much video content.
Yeah. Well, I think that's my thing. I think people, when you're just looking at PowerPoints and bullet points all the time, I find it's a bit draining. So try and go a bit heavy with the videos. Might as well use them for something to help educate the
100%. Yeah, and really useful as well. Really, really useful for actually seeing it done, because it's very different when someone's talking about it to when you're actually being shown. Let's dive into this Q&A. So first question up is on prevention. So can we just touch on any protocols for prevention of calf injuries in both completely non-injured athletes and athletes who've previously recovered from calf injury?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and this is sort of talking from a world in rugby where you've obviously got kind of huge athletes, long athletes, tiny athletes, fast ones, slow ones, that kind of thing. But what we used to use was we shifted more to like a daily screen through the season itself. So I think the most basic thing that we used to get everybody to do first thing in the morning and end of a day's training is do just a knee to wall test, really. So for anyone who doesn't know, your knee to wall test is just the distance from sort of your big toe to the wall, and basically enabling your knee to still make contact without your heel rising. So what we would normally have is sort of an in-training baseline that people were at, and then the players would enter that information into a database. So if they dropped off and that distance reduced by, say, a centimetre, we weren't too fussed. They would have to still go through like a corrective protocol in order to restore it. Again, if the range is limited by the calf, obviously the focus will be on the calf. If it's more the anterior ankle, so it's stiffness within that arthrogenic structure there, again, you might opt for a more of like a mobility approach, really. It might be the Achilles, might be pain. And again, those sorts of things were quite useful. Other things that we got people to do as part of like the windlass mechanism was maybe repeat that sometimes with something under their big toe, just so you get that natural big toe sort of first MTPJ extension that's there, and see what that's like. Because if that big toe joint is stiff, they are unlikely to get as much propulsion through there, and therefore there's going to be a bit of a kickback onto plantar fascia, onto Achilles, onto calf, potentially into hamstring that way. So we used to look at that as a little bit of a screen as an addition if we knew that someone had a history of, say, turf toes or bunions or limitations that way. And then I think probably from a strength perspective, what we would generally go for is trying to make sure that people had an absolute bare minimum of 25 straight sort of knee extended calf raises. And then we had like an equivalent for soleus depending on how big that athlete was. And then probably from that sort of baseline score stuff that we did, we always sort of then adapted and built in some preventative work. So a lot of prowler pushes were what we tended to focus on. And to be honest, the major focus with the calf was that soleus generally, because that is the one area that tends to avoid being loaded, but is, as you sort of saw from that, really. And I know I chopped a bit of the theory out at the start, but I think your soleus has a really, really vital role to play within that, to be honest. So I think you can probably apply those principles to, your injured ones, your fit ones. Obviously in pre-seasons, you've normally got a bit more time to do that. I've kind of done a sort of what we'd look at in pre-season screens on that Grow platform, if anyone wants to check it out, really.
Couple of people asking about your content and your videos, and different types of exercises. So how different would your prehab exercises look compared to the ones we've seen featured tonight, or would there be a lot of crossover, just different loads?
Yeah, good question. I think if you are working in an environment where you've got a training schedule, you kind of have to work around that a little bit. So for us, often what we would have on a Monday morning after a game on a Saturday would be that almost vitality circuit that we used to run, really. So that was very much an activation, switching everything on. So that was very much, again, sort of little bits of band around sort of the base of that big toe, getting that sort of first MTPJ extension stuff going, firing all that up, getting your sort of perineals going, your glutes fired up that way. The heavy loading, if I'm honest, that used to take place for the calf stuff used to happen normally at the end of the day before the day off. So then we still exposed that athlete to enough load, but then they had the next day to almost recover. What we didn't really want to do, and I know there's a bit of a difference in trails of thoughts, really, that the S&C staff always felt like they wanted to get more out of the players in a gym environment. And if that was in the morning, they'd work them hard. But whether or not, again, this is kind of up for debate, really, whether or not that is the better way to go, because they're then protected for the sessions running later. Or some trails of thought, and maybe mine a little bit more, is if you load heavy, then they may be a bit fatigued and a bit more vulnerable, potentially to compensatory mechanisms, altered biomechanics, that kind of thing, really.
Cool. We'll move on from the prevention angle. Bit of a backward step to assessment. Just touch on differentiating between soleus and gastroc in your objective assessment for us. So, in particular, any positional differences, different tests, and different cues as well for athletes.
Yeah, good question. So I think the history is really important. I think your gastroc probably behaves a little bit like a hamstring, with that typical shot in the back of the leg fashion. It's quite sharp. A soleus grumbles on a little bit. It often just feels like a tightness. It's often again, a lot of our Polynesian athletes often had more soleus issues, and trying to unpick exactly what was going on with them, whether it was to do with them having maybe slightly flatter feet or just more dynamic, who knows. But yeah, trying to get them to describe what was going on. They described it as like a tightness, often with their soleus problems, rather than that sort of mechanism where maybe I sort of naively thought in my early days, you know what, if it's just tight, I can release that off. Often if that grumbles on for quite a few days or weeks, the likelihood is there may be an underlying little soleus tear. And the location of that is obviously pretty important. So I'd say most of the time, your gastrocnemius tear, if you put your thumb directly onto what's typically like that proximal medial gastroc head, particularly around that sort of MTJ region, that is typically like you put your thumb on, it feels pretty sharp, it's pretty sore. And I think most people aren't that surprised because they've had a sharp pain. I think if you throw your thumb into a soleus, people are often quite surprised at how tender that really is. But that's obviously a little bit lower down. But again, a lot of these problems happen around that sort of muscular tendinous junction, really. And if there's any potential aponeurosis tears or anything in there, or tendon involvement, again, you can start to add some considerable time onto your rehab, really. And I suppose functional testing, again, I would be very, in terms of the angles that you mentioned, I would say if your knee is extended, you are far more biasing that gastroc.
Yeah.
If your knee is beyond about 60 degrees, it's not that it suddenly switches off. It's a bit of a sliding scale, obviously. But yeah, if you start to load that soleus with a bent knee, again, it's probably going to be more bias on the soleus. So if it's more painful with a bent knee, probably more soleus. If it is more painful with a straight extended knee, probably more gastroc, I'd say.
Good stuff. Question on equipment in rehab. So, and I'll probably extend it out a little bit broader than the question because it's quite specific. So, question is, what are your thoughts on using a mini trampoline in calf rehab as part of a graded progression? I guess, can we maybe extend that out to other unstable surfaces as well?
Yeah, so I guess you probably see this quite a lot, actually. There's an Achilles rupture and syndesmosis injury, actually, and a grade 3 gastroc tear that are all sort of case studies that I go through on that site, really. And you can see that, yeah, I use the trampette as an early form of impact. Again, you've got to kind of think, I suppose, about which phase it is helping with. So obviously, as you land, if they are struggling to then propel up over, that trampette can potentially offer a little bit of assistance with that. You could do that in different ways, like you could put yourself between tricep dip bars, and almost use your upper limb to assist you a little bit. If you don't have a trampette, you could use that Alter G. They're all different ways of potentially addressing different calf problems, really. But I would just go through like a clinical reasoning process, really. What is the most effective way? I think the other thing that, again, you'll probably see in the case studies if you go on, I often put a band around the athlete, because if you're just going up and down, again, it's more that vertical element. But if you put a power band or something around somebody's waist and get them to run into it, again, it's starting to address, even though it's on the spot, a little bit more of that forward propulsion element, which I think is often missed out with calf rehab. So you could try that with some of your athletes as well, really.
Cool, good stuff. We'll do one more question. JD, I can see yours, mate. Thanks for Thanks for posting that one. I think BFR is a whole presentation on its own. So we won't try and touch on that in a 2-minute answer in a Q&A because we might end up in some trouble. Stay tuned because I think we're going to cover it in a future one. So come back to us on blood flow restriction or send your questions to Steve on Twitter afterwards. I'll get told off for that. So good question here from Mark. Recapping on time under tension and slow movement. So is that to manage load in the injured muscle and to promote neuromuscular re-education and activation at the same time? And do you differ your time under tension for soleus and gastroc, or is it very case specific?
Yeah, good question. So again, I think it depends probably on the phase of rehab that you're in. So I think in the early stages, what I really focus on is trying to get that sort of muscular tendinous stiffness, so that inability for that, or that ability for the athlete to hold that sort of heel without that sort of calcaneal drop, if you like, so they get that good stickability. Now, clearly, as I sort of pointed out in there, the most of the injuries tend to occur in that terminal outer range dorsiflexion position. But I think in the early stage, so you do want to obviously load it in different positions as well. But yeah, I think in the early phases, what I want to do is really almost get enough strength and stability almost through that muscular tendinous region, if that makes sense. And then in the latter stages, obviously think a lot more about ground contact time and trying to reduce that. So that's when you get all the footwork drills going on. We'd use like force plates sometimes with athletes to give them a little bit of an objective cue just in relation to how much ground contact time they have. But yeah, I think probably in the early phases, I've probably shifted more towards some really heavy ISO loading. And again, you could say that's probably counterintuitive to trying to reduce ground contact time. But I think if you have that strength in that muscle and tendon and that control there, when they then go to run or change a direction or step, then there seems to be that transferability, which I quite like. But yeah, again, the plyo stuff, I suppose, comes later on after this one. But yeah, there's a lot more focus on almost that switch from heavy load to then almost a little bit more dynamic, to be fair. Great
stuff. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I'll get Andrew to come back in as well. We'll leave the questions there, but for anybody that does still have questions, and I know there are a couple left in the Q&A, we'll link you to Grow Physio after the presentation, growphysio.com. You can also find Steve on Twitter at Grow Physio, and I guess feel free to send your questions over in that direction if there's anything that we've not answered for you. Some final housekeeping bits from myself. We do our surveys and evaluations at the end of the sessions, partly for your own reflection from a CPD perspective, but also so that we can collect your feedback and continue to make our events better. We'll also be really, really grateful to receive your suggestions for what you'd like to see again in the future, whether that's topics or particular speakers. We do act on your feedback. So myself and Andrew met last week, and we've put a whole schedule of events in all the way into 2022. So if there is stuff you want to see, we are listening. If you would like to support our work, you can become an associate member of BASRAT, and if you'd like to do that, please get in touch. I think that's it from me. Please bear with me on sending out the post-webinar information. So the certificates and the recording, you will get them, promise. I probably won't respond to your email if you ask me, because I normally get a lot. I'll just send it when it's ready. Steve, awesome presentation. I'll hand it over to Andrew, and then we'll get things wrapped up.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. Good work comparing as always. And yeah, thanks very much, Steve, for a brilliant presentation and for kindly sharing all your expertise. I think it was brilliant, a great example of exercise rehab at its best, really, and great to see all that brilliant video content with the different exercises, and yeah, to get some real sort of detail and insight into that specific injury. And as Ollie said, and as Steve said, if you want to know more, then you know where to go. Look up Grow Physio. But thanks everyone for joining and for all your contributions as always. Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. Thanks so much again, guys, and thanks everyone for watching.
No worries. We're all going to get kicked out pretty abruptly now when I stop it. So I'll say bye to everyone, and we'll see you again soon on another event.
Thanks.